Welcome to another episode of Life Application Spiritual Truth. Help us to get the word out if you would be so kind to do. If you will give us a thumbs up, post your positive, favorable comment about the program, subscribe to our channel, and share this link through your social media so thousands of other people can be reached. We are continuing our study through the book of Romans. I call this roaming through Romans. I will be using extensively an expository outline that was produced by Dr. John MacArthur. I want to just give him credit for this. Some of the word definitions, studies, etc. is provided by him, and it's a great benefit to me. We're beginning today at Romans chapter 1 and verse number 13. Chapter 1 and verse 13. When Paul said, "I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that often I have planned to come to you and have been prevented so far, so that I may obtain some fruit among you also, even as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greeks." These verses are significantly important to even the modern day believer. And certainly they were significant to those who heard him when he first wrote this letter. We discover in these verses Paul's intentions with the Roman Christians. His intentions were highly noble. And you and I ought to have intentions that are noble toward other believers. But sometimes our intentions do not materialize. Sometimes because of poor planning on our part, and sometimes they are just not to be for whatever reason. First, we discover that Paul's intentions were not realized. He didn't get a chance to carry them out. Look at verse number 13 again. He said, "I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that often I had planned to come to you, and I was prevented." So something hindered him from coming. He had a burning desire, but something just did not allow it to work out favorable. And then he shares more about his intentions in verses 14. He had spent some time allowing his intentions to register in his heart. As a matter of fact, he said he had a reason for wanting to go in verse 13 so that the believers in Rome could receive a benefit from him. He said, "I want to come so that I can have some fruit." Well, we know when we study the life of Paul, what he always had in mind, and especially here, if he's talking about having some fruit, he's talking about one of two things: helping someone to become saved, or helping someone who is saved to strengthen and fortify their faith. So Paul felt that he was under obligation to help unbelievers develop a faith and help believers strengthen their faith. And my friend, that's the way you and I ought to feel. You ought to have at least one person that you have made it your lifelong project to advance their faith. But if you're not careful, we will get so engaged and involved in things of no significance that when a person engages with us, we will end up weakening their faith if we're not careful. So Paul wanted to strengthen their faith. As a matter of fact, he felt a sense of urgency. Look at verse 14 of Romans chapter 1. He said, I'm under obligation. That word obligation carries the idea of being a debtor. It describes a person who has an indebtedness that he must pay. He felt, I am indebted. I owe you. Can I tell you, my friend, that you and I have an indebtedness? Are we paying our indebtedness? Here is one of our indebtedness. Everything that God allows us to learn and everything that God allows us to enjoy, we have an obligation to share it with others. Everything that God has allowed you to learn, we ought to teach it to someone else. And everything that he has allowed us to accumulate, we ought to help others to move in that direction, to enjoy what we are enjoying. So for Paul, his having some fruit, he felt it was a burden. He said, I'm under obligation. Paul sometime later would write in chapter 13 and verse number 8, and he will say, owe no man nothing but to love. What's he telling us? What is he saying? That we are under obligation to share the gospel. That's a debt, and we ought to pay that debt. And then he said, I'm under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. People who are learned, those who are unlearned, those who were believers, those who were unbelievers. See, here's how you and I ought to live our life. When we encounter others, when our path intersect with others, doesn't matter who they are and where they are, our objective should be to advance them in a progressive direction, just a little bit beyond where they were. So as we interact with people, they now become more kind than they were before. They become more knowledgeable. So we advance them. And that's what Paul is trying to get us to understand by using himself as an example. He said, I am indebted. I'm under obligation. Why is he under obligation? Because God had called him for this purpose. On another occasion, he says, woe unto me if I preach not the gospel. You see an indebtedness. What do you feel an indebtedness for? You're not in this world alone. What indebtedness do you have? What spiritual indebtedness do you have to your family? What spiritual indebtedness do you have to your fellow church members? What spiritual indebtedness do you have to your next door neighbor, your coworker? Are you looking for creative ways to plant the seed, the word of God, in their hearts? Do you feel an indebtedness, an obligation that you ought to say something, you ought to do something that will move them closer to their obedience to the master? That's the kind of indebtedness that Paul is talking about. And then, in order for us to fulfill our obligation, we're going to need courage. And Paul has it. Look at verse 15. So for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. He was courageous. He uses the word eager. You're never eager to do something unless you are courageous enough to do it. You're not eager for the fight if you're scared. You're not eager for the fight if you're not courageous. You're not eager for the fight if you're not bold. See, when he had preached in Jerusalem, Paul was mobbed. It was not a favorable experience. In Athens, he was mocked. So he had preached in places he was mobbed. He had preached in places he was mocked. And now in Rome, he will be martyred. He may have known that. What kind of eagerness do we move forward with when we have a history that's not favorable? And it may be that our future is not going to be pleasurable. It's going to be painful. But he said, I'm eager. I am ready. As much as in me is, I am now ready to preach the gospel to those who are at Rome. Not only did he write the letter, but he was ready to go there and preach the gospel in person to them. Well, what causes a person to be that courageous? What causes a person to carry such a burden? Well, all of that hinges on a solid belief. Do you understand that when there is a firm belief, beliefs are powerful. Faith is powerful. No wonder then God centered his work and his administration around belief and a belief system. Notice verse 16. He said, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Why was Paul so burdened with an obligation and a responsibility? His absolute confidence that the gospel contained the power of God unto salvation. The gospel was the supreme, sufficient, yet simple message. The gospel was far superior to anything that the Roman believers had ever encountered. First of all, Paul declares the gospel is the power of God. This word translated power is from a word that we get our English word dynamite. The gospel carries with it the power of God. And this power is sufficient to save men from their sin. So then, Paul felt an obligation. How do you feel about the gospel, my friend? Do you feel an obligation? Do you feel an indebtedness to share the gospel, the good news with those who are lost? Yes, it's the gospel. Is the gospel a priority in your life? We appreciate you taking the time to roam through the book of Romans with us. Post your favorable comments. Give us a thumbs up and share this link with every person in your social media, and you will help us to get the word out to thousands and hundreds of people. We appreciate you taking the journey with us. We look forward to you taking another journey with us. Same time, same station,